Chapter 29. Stephen. Stephen had green hair. He had purple ears and a blue face. He wore his sister's pink dancing shoes and green leotards. The leotards matched his hair. He was all dressed up as a goblin for Mrs. Jewls' Halloween party. But unfortunately, it wasn't Halloween. "Ha ha! You sure look silly," said Jason. Jason was Stephen's best friend. "So do you," said Stephen. Jenny said, "Halloween is on Sunday. Today is only Friday." "Ha!" said Stephen. "You'll probably come to school on Sunday. Mrs. Jewls said we'd have a party today." But none of the other children wore costumes, only Stephen. "All right, class," said Mrs. Jewls. "It is time for our Halloween party." "See," said Stephen. Mrs. Jewls gave each child a cookie that looked like an orange witch with a black hat. She laughed when she saw Stephen and forgot to give him one. Stephen didn't ask for it. He was afraid that she'd laugh again. The children finished their cookies in less than 30 seconds. "All right, class," said Mrs. Jewls. "The party is over. We have a lot of work to do." Stephen felt like a fool. The party lasted less than a minute, and he was going to have to spend the rest of the day wearing this goblin suit. "Look, Stephen's wearing his sister's leotards," laughed Dana. "They're green, just like his hair," said Fatso. Everybody laughed. Mrs. Jewls began the math lesson. She wrote on the chalkboard, 2 plus 2 equals 5. "That's wrong," Joy shouted. Mrs. Jewls tried again. 2 plus 2 equals 3. That wasn't right either. She added 2 and 2 again and got 43. It was useless. No matter how hard she tried, she could not get 2 plus 2 to equal 4. "I don't understand it," she said. "They've always equaled 4 before." Suddenly she screamed. The chalk turned into a squiggling worm. She dropped it on her foot. Then all the lights went out, and the chalkboard lit up like a movie screen. A woman appeared on the screen. She had a long tongue and pointed ears. She stepped off the screen and into the classroom. It was the ghost of Mrs. Gorf. Mrs. Gorf ran her fingernails across the chalkboard. "Trick or treat, you rotten kids," she said. "Now I'll get even with every last one of you. Where's Todd?" "Who is that?" asked Mrs. Jewls. "Mrs. Gorf," said Damien. "Who's Mrs. Gorf?" asked Mrs. Jewls. "She was the meanest teacher we ever had," said Rondi. "What happened to her?" asked Mrs. Jewls. "Louis ate her," said Jason. "Well, I'm not going to allow this," said Mrs. Jewls. "Get out of my classroom," she demanded. "It's Halloween, sweet teacher," said Mrs. Gorf. "Ghosts can go anywhere they like. I've come for a little class reunion." "But it isn't Halloween," said Mrs. Jewls. "Halloween is still 2 days away." "I know," said Mrs. Gorf, "but Halloween falls on a Sunday this year, so we are celebrating it on the Friday before." Stephen leaped up from his seat. "See, I was right," he said. "Today is the day we celebrate it, the Friday before. Mrs. Gorf proved it." He ran up to Mrs. Gorf. "They all laughed at me and made me feel silly because I was the only one who got dressed up. But they were the ones who were wrong. You and I are right." He put his arms around Mrs. Gorf and hugged her. Mrs. Gorf gasped and disappeared. The lights came back on. Mrs. Jewls picked up the piece of chalk from the floor. She wrote on the chalkboard, 2 plus 2 equals 4. "Oh, that's good," she said. "When 2 plus 2 doesn't equal 4, anything can happen." All the children who had laughed at Stephen now called him a hero, but they told him to change out of his costume. So at lunch, Stephen went home, washed up, and changed. He came back wearing blue jeans and a polo shirt. Of course, his hair was still green. It always was.